Chapter 23, if you would like to go ahead and open your Bibles there. Acts chapter 23, and I am putting the outline on the screen behind me. We have already in this class covered the parts of the outline on the screen behind me, Paul standing before the Sanhedrin. Of course, we know the background of that. At the conclusion of his third missionary journey, he come to Jerusalem, bringing the tithes bringing the offerings that he had collected there from the brethren in various different churches to deliver this gift to the Jewish brethren there at Jerusalem who had been suffering through great affliction. And while he was there, some of those Jews from Asia that he had had issues with in the past, well, they stirred up some trouble and made some false accusation against him, and he's been arrested, and he was able to give a defense there on the steps to the fortress of Antonia where he was held captive. And then he is able to, then the commander of the guard there calls the Sanhedrin council together the next day, and Paul is allowed to address them. Of course, the high priest Ananias has him smitten on the mouth as soon as he begins to speak, and there's a little bit of a situation there. But then that night, as discouraging as that situation must have been, that night Paul was visited by the Lord, verse number 11. And that's the last verse I remember addressing last week, so I'm going to choose that as the place to start this morning. Let's look at verse 11 again, chapter 23, verse 11. And the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome." And so over the last 24 to 48 hours, Paul has been attacked with deadly intent 3 times now, and he has been rescued by the Romans for 3 times. Nothing that has been said has seemed to have any effect for good on those to whom he spoke. And I would just assume if I was in his shoes at this point in time, I might be in need of some encouragement. I might even be feeling like somewhat of a failure. Paul was in many ways a better man than I, and so maybe he didn't feel these things, but that's certainly how I would have felt. At any rate, the Lord appears to him that night. We're not told exactly how. I would suppose in a vision, like Acts chapter 18, verses 9 and 10, a previous occasion when the Lord appeared to him, and it specifically stated then that it was in a vision or he was in a trance. And so I suppose that's probably how the Lord did that this time as well. But the Lord appears to him and lets him know that he is pleased with his testimony. That would be music to my ears. If he was doubting himself, the Lord tells him he's pleased with his testimony. And also he lets him know that not only have you testified to me here, but you're going to testify for me at Rome as well. And so if Paul had any doubts whether he would survive this incident over the next few days, then that should have set his mind at ease, because now he knows he's going to go to Rome and testify as well. And another encouraging thing about that was that Paul had previously stated when he wrote the Romans that he desired to come to them and to impart some gift upon them. And so it would be certainly pleasant for Paul to know that he was going to make that trip to Rome, although maybe not the way he had envisioned it or hoped it. Perhaps the Lord recalled his own similar experiences with some of the Jewish leaders might have been still serving that served when the events in Jesus' life happened. But certainly the Lord might have recalled those experiences that he had with similar Jewish leaders. And the Hebrew writer tells us, chapter 4, verse 15, "For we have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin." And so certainly the Lord could empathize with Paul in this situation. The phrase "stood at his side," the Lord stood at his side, it can be taken both literally in the sense that perhaps in the vision, the trance, or in whatever rate, perhaps he literally stood at his side, but it can also be taken symbolically to indicate that the Lord had not forsaken him. Rather than forsaking him, the Lord stood by his side. And I'm reminded in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 16 and 17, that Paul said to Timothy, "At my first answer no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. I pray God that it may not be laid to their charge. Notwithstanding, the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, and that by me the preaching might be fully known, and that all the Gentiles might hear. And I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion." And so, in this next section, verses 12 through 27, now a plot is revealed to us by Luke, a plot to take Paul's life. Is this the third time or the fourth time? I'm kind of losing count. There's so many attempts being made upon Paul's life here. We could divide this up into three different sections. I like this. When I see a neat little outline, I like it, and I like to put it in my notes. I never know when I might want to turn a section like this into a sermon, and so I have my points already made. And so here we have a plot against Paul, and we could divide this up as the plot made, verses 12 through 15, the plot is exposed, verses 16 through 22, and the plot is foiled, verses 23 through 35. And so let's look at the plot. Beginning at verse 12, we'll read through verse 15. "And when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And they were more than 40 which had made this conspiracy. And they came to the chief priests and the elders and said, We have bound ourselves under a great curse, that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul. Now therefore ye, with the council, signify to the chief captain that he bring him down unto you tomorrow, as though you would inquire of something more perfectly concerning him, and we, or ever he come near, are ready to kill him." And so, even as the Lord and Paul it spoke to Paul of his future, the apostles' enemies were already conspiring and considering how they might prevent him from having a future. Frustrated that Paul had slipped through their fingers in the court of the Gentiles and again in the council chambers, the Jews have now devised a plan which they think is foolproof, and it sounds like it very easily could go off without a hitch. There were more than 40 of them who bound themselves to this oath. What was the identity of these Jews specifically? We don't know. Were they the Hellenistic Jews who had tried to kill Paul 2 decades earlier in chapter 9, verse 29? Were they the Asiatic Jews who started the riot in the temple complex just days ago? Or were they sympathizers of the Sadducees who were sitting on the council that Paul just stood beside? We don't really know, but I have made all those possibilities, gave all those possibilities just to underline the fact that Paul has a lot of enemies in the city. Yes, sir, Brother Dewey.
But there is one thing we do know for sure. These are Jews who think they are upholding the law of Moses and yet are violating the thou shalt not kill of Exodus 20:13.
Absolutely. They think that they're doing God a favor. At least probably some of them. I believe some of them were so corrupt that they probably didn't care. But for some of them, they probably thought they were like Paul. When he was hauling men and women off to prison and giving his consent for them to be put to death, they thought they were doing what was right. At least some of them. It reminds me, and in fact I had even put this in my notes, what Jesus said in John 16 verse 2, "They shall put you out of the synagogues. Yea, the time cometh that whosoever killeth you will think that he doeth God a service." And so this is an example of that very thing. What does this say about the council and the deplorable condition that the high council of all the Jews, the Sanhedrin council, has come to when these murderous men would plainly reveal their plan to them and even ask them to be complicit in it? What does that say about the state of the Jewish council? And not only did they reveal their plan and ask them to be complicit, verse number 20 seems to suggest that the council was willing to be complicit. And so one commentator said of this, quote, "Jerusalem was certainly far from God when more than 40 men could conspire in the name of religion to slay a godly Jew, and when even the chief priests and elders were part of the crime, end quote. The fact that the plot was conceived and participated in by the council, I think, is another proof of the innocence of Paul. For if they felt like Paul had really violated a crime, they should have had some faith in the legal system, that he would be condemned for it. But this shows that they really knew that Paul had not committed any crime worthy of that he would be sentenced under. There wasn't any evidence of it because he didn't do it. And so they were willing to go around the law to see that their will would be done. Verses 16 through 22, the plot is exposed. Verses 16 through 22. And when Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered into the castle and told Paul. And Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Bring this young man to the chief captain, for he hath a certain thing to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the chief captain and said, "Paul the prisoner called me into him, and prayed me to bring this young man unto thee, who hath something to say unto thee." Then the chief captain took him by the hand and went with him aside privately and asked him, "What is it that thou hast to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to desire thee that thou wouldest bring down Paul tomorrow into the council, as though they would inquire of something of him more perfectly. But do not yield thou unto them, for there lie in wait of him more than 40 men, which have bound themselves with an oath that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him, and now are they ready, looking for a promise from thee." So the chief captain then let the young man depart and charged him, "See that they tell no man that thou hast showed these things to me." And so I think this passage, there's not a whole lot of comment to make on this particular passage, but what I do see in it, I see the providence of God. The fact that Paul's own nephew would just happen to be in the right place and at the right time to overhear a murder plot, number one, and two, that plot would be against his own uncle. That's beyond coincidental, if you ask me. And then the fact that the Roman officer that was commander of the post, that he was even willing to hear what the young man had to say to him, and was willing to consider and react. You know, there was a lot of corruption in the Roman Empire. This could have played out a lot differently. And so I see the providence of God. Obviously, when Jesus stood with Paul the night previous and told him that he would speak and he would bear testimony in Rome also, God's plan is not going to be thwarted by men. And so Jesus certainly knew what was going to happen in these, and perhaps he was even working anonymously, or what we call providentially. Paul is taken to Caesarea, verses 23 through 35. Any questions or comments, feel free, just raise your hand or shout out if I don't see you. All right, verse 23, the plot is foiled because Paul is taken to Caesarea. And he called unto him, that is the commander, the chief captain, the commander of the guard there. He called unto him 2 centurions, saying, "Make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200 at the 3rd hour of the night, and provide them beasts that they may set Paul on and bring him safe unto Felix the governor." So if you add this up, it's 470 men to escort one prisoner. And some critics, they're looking for things to scoff at, and this is one of the things that they point out. Well, 470 men, this is obviously not accurate. Well, I think there are some explanations for this. Why would so many soldiers be warranted? Possibly he wanted to make this look like a standard military procedure as much as possible to avoid further revolting of the Jews. He's not trying to draw attention to the fact of what's happening. He's learned some insider information, and so perhaps he's just trying to make this look as normal as possible. these groups of soldiers going in and out of town like this were probably a pretty frequent sight. Another possibility is that if a Roman commander was trying to make sure that all of his T's were crossed and all of his I's are dotted, perhaps he wanted to make all the numbers so intimidatingly large that no one would dare attack them. There's certainly no indication of falsehood by this. The third hour of the night, that would have been about 3 p.m., and it says that beasts, the reference, in other words, beasts of burden, horses, donkeys, etc. Some versions say mounts. Verse number 25, excuse me. And he wrote a letter after this manner. And so I'm going to just stop right here and just point out that it sounds to me like what is about to follow is an actual copy of the letter sent from the commander. Although the wording by Luke here, after this manner, it could be taken as similar to this fashion or an abbreviation. We know Luke is given abbreviated accounts, and so either way, it reads to me, as I read it, it reads to me like it's probably an actual account. Again, critics have tried to discredit this information, saying that there is no way that Luke could have known the contents of this message. Well, first of all, under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, a man can know anything that God knows, which is everything. But even in addition to that, this is an extremely short-sighted accusation. It is possible that this letter was read out loud when Paul arrived in Caesarea. And so that could be an explanation. Paul could have heard it out loud. Perhaps Luke was with Paul. It does say beasts, plural. Perhaps Luke and some of Paul's companions were able to go to Caesarea and be with him there. Perhaps they heard it aloud. Perhaps Paul heard it aloud and orated it to Luke. But regardless, maybe the records were even made public, something that during the 2 years that Paul was in prison there in Caesarea, maybe Luke could go around and pull those documents and read the official account. There's all kinds of answers for someone who's not trying to find an accusation to make against the Bible. Continuing verse 26 through 30. Claudius Lysias, and now this is the actual wording as best we can tell, and for the first time we have the man who was previously just referred to as the chief captain or the commander. Here we have his name finally named. Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor Felix, sendeth greeting. This man was taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. And when I would have known the cause whereof they accused him, I brought him forth into their council, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. And when it was told me how the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee, and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell. And so a couple things to point out here. First of all, related to our introductory material, he addresses him as Most Excellent Governor Felix. And this title, Most Excellent, was something that we read in historical documents related to Rome and other countries. It was a title that was given to Roman officials or special citizens of renown. You might liken it to over in England when someone does something really renowned and they are given a title by the crown. They might be referred to as Sir, and so Sir Paul McCartney, Sir. There's many of them. And so this is a similar phrase, but what's important to what is it's important to us? Remember, who is Luke writing this epistle to, or this treatise to? And who did he write the previous one that we call the Gospel of Luke? Most Excellent Theophilus. Some have suggested that Theophilus wasn't even a real man, that it was just probably somebody meant to represent just Christians as a whole, but I would deny that. Luke wrote to a man called Most Excellent Theophilus, and so most likely this man to whom Luke was writing was a Roman official. And that might account for the reason why he includes this official report in the book of the Bible as well, so that the one to whom he originally wrote it, if he was also a Roman citizen, it would bear some weight to him as he's reading this account that here's the official report of the chief commander who was there on the scene. Anyway, not to belabor that, moving on, verse number 29, as confused as the commander was about what happened in the temple, he could see that the disagreement was a theological one and not a political one. And perhaps that's the reason, again, that Luke might have included this so that Theophilus could see that as well. Verse number 31, then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris, I think is the right way. Antipatris. Antipatris, I'm going to show you a map on the screen here where Antipatris is located in relation to Caesarea. This location was a military station situated on the border between Judea and Samaria, about 35 miles from Jerusalem, a little over halfway to Caesarea. The Old Testament name of Antipatris was Aphek. It's recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 1, where in a conflict between the Jews, the Israelites, and the Philistines camped at this location, whereas the Israelites camped at another location. The city had been rebuilt by Herod the Great, and he named it after his father, Antipater. On the morning they left the horsemen to go with him and return to the castle. And so, just in case, a suggestion as to why perhaps many of the soldiers went back to Jerusalem and left the horsemen to carry Paul the rest of the way. The terrain from Jerusalem to Antipatris was a mountainous region. There would have been lots of opportunities and places for there to be an ambush by the Jews, and which might also account for why there were so many troops. But from this location on to Caesarea, if you can tell just by looking at the map on the screen behind me, this is open and flat territory. And so therefore, the 400 soldiers and spearmen returned to Jerusalem to resume their peacekeeping duties, leaving the 70 horsemen to take Paul the rest of the way. And furthermore, the 70 horsemen could make time a whole lot quicker than they could if soldiers on foot were accompanying them. So, verse 33, who when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. I just can imagine that if any of the Christians that saw that Paul visited when he was in Caesarea on the way to Jerusalem, if they saw these 70 plus mounted legionnaires coming into town and all of them surrounding Paul, they must have been amazed at just how quickly that prophecy of Agabus had been fulfilled. Remember, Agabus signified that the one who wears this girdle is going to be bound by the Gentiles. And here it is, just a matter of, a week or two later, by my estimation, unless I'm missing something. And here they see Paul come back into town, escorted by all these horsemen and being bound. Now Paul will stand before Governor Felix, who is the most powerful political figure in all of Palestine. Now this is the same position that Pontius Pilate once filled. Now the same position is filled by Governor Felix. In that time between Pontius Pilate and Governor Felix, there were 6 others who served, and their terms were somewhere between 1 and 5 years each. Verse 34, and when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was, and when he understood that he was of Cilicia, he said, I will hear thee, when thine accusers are also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. And so why he asked him what province he was from, I don't really entirely know, but perhaps it had something to do with jurisdiction, because as soon as he heard what providence, from which providence he hailed, then he immediately said, I will hear thee. So it might have been something to do with jurisdiction. And so he said, I will hear thee when your accusers come. And so he was confined there to Herod's judgment hall. The actual Greek word there that's translated judgment hall is praetorium. Herod's praetorium is a more literal translation. The praetorium is a term used for an official residence, and there were several of these mentioned throughout Scripture. This particular praetorium was one built by Herod the Great, and it retained his name. It now served as an official headquarters of the Roman governor there in Caesarea. Rather than calling this jail or prison, as we often call it, it would really more accurately be described as a safe house. Paul's he's not bound in the sense that we might, when I think of prison, I think of somebody locked in a little small cell. They can't go, they can't get at it. They don't have anybody to talk to. They're just given bread. They're just given water, just the bare necessities of life. That doesn't seem to be the case here at all. Paul is just being protected and kept until the trial can take place. He will be confined here for 2 long years, though, chapter 24, verse 27. What about those 40-plus assassins who had vowed that they wouldn't eat or drink until Paul was dead? Well, they starved to death, no doubt, right? No, I doubt it. I very seriously doubt it. Can you just imagine how frustrated they were when they learned that their plot had been defeated and that Paul wasn't even in the city anymore? And so as conscious as they were about their vow, I bet they got very hungry if they tried to keep it. But since the Jews were adept at reneging on their vows, I doubt that they missed very many meals. Now that brings us to the end of chapter 23. Do you have any questions or comments? Anything I overlooked? Anything you're uncertain about that I misspoke about? Now's the time. All right. Let's look then at chapter 24. Chapter 24 on the screen is an outline of this chapter, and I'll begin with an overview, what you might expect in this chapter. In this chapter, the high priest, Ananias, makes the trip to Caesarea. Of course, Paul's being held there until his accusers come and make their accusations. The high priest, probably very angrily, makes the trip to Caesarea. He brings some elders with him, probably some of his favorites among the Sanhedrin council. And they also bring a hired gun with them, a lawyer who's skilled in the art of rhetoric, one who probably knows very well the Roman laws and customs better than most Jews would. They all come and this orator, this lawyer, he brings the charges, lays out the accusations against Paul. Paul denies these charges against him, presents the facts that led up to the case, points out some holes or inconsistencies in the plaintiff's case, and then he presents the real motive of his attackers. And again, he goes back to what was in the last chapter. It's about the resurrection of Jesus Christ that I'm called into question this day. And then Felix decides that he's going to retain Paul under house arrest until the commander can come and give testimony, which is awful strange because the commander has already given his testimony by means of the letter. And from the facts that were presented, it doesn't really seem like it'd be a necessary move to make, but as we will see, Felix had some ulterior motives. We find in verse number 26 of this chapter that the truth of the matter was Felix was a corrupt man, and he was holding Paul, and he was hoping that Paul would try to slip him some money under the table. Later, Paul was given a chance to preach Christ to Felix and his wife Drusilla, who reject the message. It seems that they only had a casual interest in what Paul had to say. Maybe they just wanted to hear his testimony for sport rather than any other reason. Doesn't seem to be any seriousness on the part of Felix and Drusilla. The chapter ends with Luke noting that Felix's term as governor ends and his successor, Festus, keeps Paul bound in order to pander to the Jews. And so Felix gets ousted, and if you thought somebody better was going to come along, sadly, Festus isn't much better. Festus is going to keep Paul bound and to do with the Jews a favor. And so that's what you can expect, bird's eye view, overview of this chapter. Let's begin in verses 1 through 9. We probably won't get past this section this morning. 1 through 9. The trial begins with accusations against Paul. Verse 1. And after 5 days, Ananias the high priest descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. So Jerusalem was 2,400 feet above sea level. Caesarea, as you can see in the picture here, Caesarea is on the coast. And so that's the reason it says, and the high priest descended with the elders. I've actually heard of some other Bible critics and skeptics who wanted to suggest that this was a geographical inaccuracy in the Bible. And they wanted to understand it this way: north is up, south is down. And so they're trying to say, see, Luke said that they went south, but in reality, Caesarea is north. Petty argument. That's not at all what's being said. And so I want to point out, 2,400 feet above sea level Jerusalem is, and yet Caesarea is down on the coast. And so that's why they descended. They literally descended. And the text says the high priest came, and he brought some accompanying elders with him. Caesarea was about 60 miles from Jerusalem, which underscores the determination of these men to bring harm to Paul. Even though they knew they didn't have a real case against Paul, they're still willing to go 60 miles to bring him harm. They bring with them this orator named Tertullus. The Greek word here, translated in the King James as orator, the Greek word is rhetor. It's from the word from which we get our English word rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing. And so this man, he's an orator. He is skilled in the art of rhetoric. This man is what we would call a lawyer. He's one who would be very familiar with Roman laws and customs, someone that the Sanhedrin Council probably kept on retainer as a consultant. And he immediately begins to show his skill in rhetoric by just throwing out all kinds of flattery. It's all just too apparent in the words that follow. And so beginning at verse 2, we're going to read what Tertullus has to say. With just a few little breaks, I just want to point out just a word or two along the way as I read through verse 9. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, notice the flattery he starts with here, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thanksgiving. Oh, he's a silver tongue, isn't he? Now, I just want to point out, just side note here, this verse number 2 is the only verse in all the Bible where we read the word providence, which means protective care. And even though this is the only place in all of Scripture where we find the word, of course, the concept is found abundantly. And so when we're talking about the providence of God, we're talking about God's protective care, and usually in contrast to his doing it miraculously, but doing it by natural means, according to the general rules of nature that God has put in place. But at any rate, here's the word. Verse 4, notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency, or mercy, lenience, a few words. For we have found this man a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also have gone about to profane the temple, whom we took, and we would have judged according to our law, but the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come unto thee, by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of these things, whereof we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, saying that these things were so. And so here's Mr. Silvertongue using his skill in rhetoric. He begins with compliments and flattery in order to win the governor over to his cause. The things he said weren't necessarily untrue, but there was a little bit of a spin put on them. McGarvey noted in his commentary, the complimentary words with which the speech is introduced were not undeserved by Felix, for he had restored tranquility to the country, when it was disturbed first by hordes of robbers, and afterwards by organized bands of assassins, and more recently by that Egyptian for whom Lysias at first mistook Paul. In suppressing all these disturbances, his administration had been prosperous, end quote. And so though Felix had indeed put down several rebellions, Roper, another commentator, noted that he had done so with such a ruthlessness that would have enraged even moderate Jews. Most citizens of Judea would have said that whatever peace existed was in spite of Felix's efforts and not because of him. And so Tertullius also did not mention the historical fact that Governor Felix had also been behind an assassination of Jonathan, another high priest. And it was probably hard, I imagine, for the high priests and the elders who stood by and listened to this flattery to hide the disgust on their faces while he praised this heathen man who had assassinated one of their own high priests. There were three, and when you look at the accusations he actually made against Paul, I divide them into three different accusations. Accusation number one was a personal one, a personal charge. He was charged with being a pestilent fellow. Pestilent, in other words, someone who causes trouble, someone who is injurious to peace. But why did Paul cause them trouble? He caused them trouble because he pointed out the sins and the errors of the religious leaders. What's the second charge? The second charge is the more serious one, at least one that might be more seriously viewed by Governor Felix. It was a political charge. He was charged with being an insurrectionist against the lawful rule of Rome. See, Roman authorities were very quick to put down any rebellion, and they did so ruthlessly. And so it would appear that this charge, above all, would have the potential to incite anger in Felix against Paul and turn him against not only Paul but anyone who followed him, because they mentioned that Paul was also a ringleader of a sect of Nazarenes. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And so, but first, these things that this was untrue. Paul had not incited any rebellion against Rome, and Paul will point that out when he gives his defense. Now, this verse is the only place in Scripture where we find this term Nazarenes. It is used to refer to Christians. This is not an approved example here that we might use so that we might start calling ourselves Nazarenes. This is not a term of endearment. This is a term of derision. It was a designated nation used by the Jews to mean a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. And it was a term of derision. Remember the statement John 1:46, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And so the Jews, this was a term of derision here, not one that we should ever use of ourselves. And so we have a personal charge, a political charge, and the third charge is a religious charge. He was accused of attempting to profane the Jewish temple. Now notice the softer stance here that would be much harder to prove. Previously, back in chapter 21, verse 28, Paul was originally accused of profaning the temple. Now it's a little softer. He's accused of attempting. Oh, am I out of time? Okay. Now he is attempting to profane the temple. And so I think I'm out of time. I apologize if I went over. We will pick up right here with this religious charge next week and make the points that I failed to mention. Appreciate your attention, your comments.